"Get away from me, you disgusting beggar!" The voice echoed through the city's most exclusive restaurant like a whip crack in elegant silence. Isabella Santana, 28 years old, model and influencer with 500,000 followers, pushed the raggedly dressed man with such force that he nearly fell onto the neighboring tables. The other diners stopped eating to watch the spectacle. Tuxedoed waiters observed in embarrassment. Isabella's wealthy friends laughed like hyenas before wounded prey. What she didn't know was that she had just humiliated her own husband in the cruelest possible way. Eduardo Santana, a 55-year-old billionaire who owned an empire worth $80 million, was there disguised as a beggar for the most important test of his marriage. And what happened next changed both their lives forever. I am the butler billionaire, and this is a story you should never hear, but you need to. Because in the golden halls of extreme wealth, where Dom Perignon champagne flows like water and diamonds adorn necks like dewdrops, sometimes the emptiest hearts are hidden. And today you will discover the true price of marrying a soul that only sees dollar signs. Prepare yourself. This is not a story for the faint of heart. It was a Tuesday in December when Eduardo Santana made the decision that would define his marriage's destiny. Sitting in his 4,000-square-foot office on the 40th floor of the city's most luxurious building, he watched through bulletproof glass windows the city he had helped build with his developments. At 55, Eduardo possessed everything money could buy. A fortune of $80 million built through brilliant real estate investments, mansions in 3 countries, a car collection that would make any enthusiast weep with envy, watches that cost more than entire apartments. But there was one thing money couldn't give him, the certainty of being loved for who he really was, not for what he owned. Eduardo had met Isabella 3 years ago at a fashion event in Miami. She was stunning, that was true. Blonde hair that cascaded like liquid gold, green eyes that looked like polished emeralds, a sculptural body maintained by expensive personal trainers and discreet but effective plastic surgeries. She conquered him with charm and intelligence. She knew how to talk about art, spoke 3 languages, had opinions about expensive wines. She seemed the perfect companion for a man of his social level. They married in a $2 million ceremony in Tuscany, with 300 guests, 3 different bands, and fireworks that lit up the Italian sky like an artificial aurora borealis. Isabella wore a $150,000 dress. Eduardo gifted her a $500,000 ring. During the first 2 years, everything seemed like a fairy tale. They traveled the world in private jets. Isabella posted photos in 5-star hotels, always tagging the luxury brands she wore. Her followers grew from 100,000 to 500,000. She had become a successful influencer, selling the dream of a life of absolute abundance. But Eduardo began to notice small things that bothered him. When they dined at home, Isabella was always on her phone, responding to comments, posting stories, interacting with brands that wanted partnerships. Real conversations became rare. She seemed more interested in photographing the expensive food they prepared than in savoring it together. At social events, she would distance herself from him whenever younger or wealthier men appeared. Eduardo watched her from afar, conversing animatedly with more successful businessmen, giving little laughs she never gave him. But what disturbed him most was how she treated employees. Drivers, housekeepers, waiters, all were invisible to Isabella. She spoke to them like they were objects, when she spoke at all. Usually she just pointed, gestured, expected them to guess her wishes. Eduardo remembered how his own mother, a simple woman who had worked as a seamstress her whole life, had taught him to treat all people with respect. Even after becoming rich, he greeted doormen, thanked cleaning ladies, talked with drivers about their families. Isabella found this ridiculous. "You're a billionaire, Eduardo," she would say. "People like us don't need to waste time being nice to employees." The last straw happened 3 months before the test. They were leaving an expensive restaurant when a homeless person approached asking for food. He was an elderly man, perhaps 65 years old, with worn but clean clothes, dignified posture despite his situation. Eduardo stopped naturally to talk. The man told him he had lost his job during the pandemic, couldn't pay rent, ended up on the street 6 months ago. He spoke politely. It was clear he was educated. "Sir, I don't want money," he said. "I just wanted to know if there was any food left from your dinner. It's been 2 days since I've had anything hot to eat." Eduardo felt his heart squeeze. "Of course, my friend." He returned to the restaurant, asked them to wrap up a complete meal, paid $200 extra tip to the waiter, and also gave $500 to the elderly man. "May God bless you, sir," the man said with tears in his eyes. When Eduardo returned to the car, he found Isabella furious. "Are you crazy?" she screamed. "Giving money to beggars is the same as financing addiction. They use it to buy liquor and drugs." "He seemed sober, love." Eduardo responded calmly. "I was just trying to help." "Trying to help?" Isabella laughed with scorn. "Eduardo, people like that were born to be poor. If it wasn't this, it would be something else. It's destiny." The coldness in those words echoed in Eduardo's mind for days. How could the woman who said she loved him be so insensitive to human suffering? That's when he decided to do the test. He hired Roberto Silva, a makeup specialist who had worked on soap operas and films for 30 years. He explained that he needed to disguise himself as a beggar in an absolutely convincing way. Roberto worked for 2 weeks. He created a graying and matted fake beard. He applied makeup to age Eduardo's face, creating deep wrinkles, sun marks, the weathered skin of someone who lives on the street. He selected worn clothes that still maintained a remnant of dignity. A faded dress shirt, patched dress pants, old but polished shoes. The disguise was perfect. When Eduardo looked in the mirror, he saw an elderly, needy man, someone whom life had punished, but who still preserved his humanity. On the Thursday scheduled for the test, Eduardo made sure Isabella would follow her usual routine. Every Thursday, she dined at Palazzo d'Oro, the city's most exclusive restaurant, with her wealthy friends. It was a sacred tradition. They met at 8 p.m., ordered the $800 tasting menu per person, drank $1,500 champagne by the bottle, and spent 3 hours gossiping about other rich people. Eduardo knew that environment well. He had dined at Palazzo hundreds of times, always treated like royalty by the staff. The maitre d' Giuseppe, a 50-year-old Italian, received him with absolute reverence. The waiters competed to serve him. His usual table was number 7, in the center of the hall, from where he could observe the entire restaurant. Now, at 8:30 p.m. on a rainy Thursday, Eduardo approached the entrance of the same restaurant dressed as a beggar. His transformation was complete. He walked slightly hunched over, like someone carrying the weight of many disappointments. His steps were hesitant, the posture of someone who had learned to ask permission to exist in spaces he didn't consider his by right. When he pushed the heavy glass door of Palazzo d'Oro, the silence that followed was deafening. The restaurant at that hour was at its peak activity. About 60 people, the cream of São Paulo high society. Businessmen, politicians, artists, all flaunting wealth like war medals. Men in $10,000 suits, women covered in jewelry that cost more than houses. And there was Isabella, table 12, in the noble corner of the hall. She wore a royal blue Versace dress that Eduardo had bought for her in Milan, 15,000 euros. Around her neck, the diamond necklace she had received as a birthday gift, $200,000. On her wrists, the $80,000 Cartier bracelet. She was the personification of expensive elegance. At the table with her were her 3 inseparable friends. Fernanda Moraes, 30 years old, wife of an agribusiness magnate, heiress to a family of millionaire coffee growers. Born rich, married even richer. Never worked a day in her life, but considered herself an expert on everything. Carla Mendonça, 35 years old, divorced from a famous soccer player, still lives off the millionaire pension she receives. spends her days at spas, traveling and gossiping maliciously about other women. And Patricia Santos, 32 years old, retired model who married a businessman 30 years older, has a daughter she barely knows, raised by nannies, while she dedicates herself to maintaining an appearance of eternal youth. The four women represented what was most superficial in high society, united not by genuine friendship, but by social convenience and the shared pleasure of feeling superior to others. When Eduardo entered the restaurant, they were precisely commenting on an acquaintance who had lost money in investments. Poor Marina, Fernanda was saying, had to sell her beach apartment. Imagine the humiliation. Now she only has one house. Only one house? Carla laughed. That's not living, that's surviving. I don't even greet her at events anymore, Patricia added. I don't want people to think I associate with broke people. Isabella laughed approvingly at each cruel word when she noticed movement at the entrance, her eyes fixed on the raggedly dressed man who had just entered, and her expression changed instantly. What is that? She said loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. Giuseppe, the maitre d', approached the disguised man nervously. He recognized something was wrong. A beggar wouldn't normally enter an establishment of that level, but he didn't recognize Eduardo under the perfect disguise. Sir, Giuseppe said politely, can I help you with something? Eduardo perfectly interpreted the role he had rehearsed. His voice came out trembling, humble, laden with wounded but still present dignity. Excuse me for bothering you. I just wanted to ask for some water. It's been 2 days since I've had anything but public tap water. My granddaughter said maybe here it would be possible. The silence in the restaurant intensified. 60 pairs of eyes fixed on the scene. The situation was embarrassing for everyone. Expelling an elderly man who asked only for water would be too cruel, but allowing him to stay might disturb the wealthy clientele. That's when Isabella stood up from the table. How ridiculous is this? She screamed, her voice echoing through the hall like a whip. What is this disgusting beggar doing here? Eduardo felt each word like a stab. He looked directly at the woman he had been married to for 3 years, the woman who had sworn to love him in wealth and poverty, in sickness and health. She looked at him with the same disgust she would have for a cockroach on the floor. Fernanda joined the spectacle, standing up as well. "Waiter!" she yelled. "Call security! This is absurd. We pay a fortune to dine in peace, not to be bothered by beggars." Carla had already taken out her phone and started filming. "People, you won't believe what's happening," she narrated to the camera. "A homeless person invaded the city's most expensive restaurant. This is going to get millions of views." Patricia clapped as if watching a show. "Throw out that disgusting thing," she screamed. "He must be full of diseases." But it was Isabella who reached the peak of cruelty. She walked up to Eduardo, her $2,000 heels echoing on the Italian marble like judges' hammers. She stopped less than a meter from her disguised husband and studied him from head to toe with absolute contempt. "Listen here, you useless old man," she said, her voice low but loaded with venom. "Do you think you can enter a place where important people dine? Do you think you have the right to breathe the same air as us?" Eduardo felt tears burn behind his eyes, but not from humiliation. It was from the pain of discovering that the woman he thought he loved was capable of such cruelty. "Madam," he murmured, maintaining the characterization, "I just wanted some water. I won't bother anyone else." "Water?" Isabella laughed, a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Do you know how much water costs here? Each glass is worth more than you could collect in a month begging." She opened her $30,000 Hermes bag and took out a $100 bill. With a theatrical movement, she threw the money on the marble floor. "Take this hand out and get out of decent people's sight," she said with disgust, "and take a bath before appearing in public again." The entire restaurant was watching. Some clients seemed uncomfortable, but no one had the courage to intervene. The power of money created a bubble of impunity around Isabella and her friends. Eduardo looked at the bill on the floor and felt that everything he had built as a husband died there. 3 years of marriage, millions spent pampering that woman, entire nights listening to her problems, supporting her career as an influencer, introducing her to the most important contacts in his social network, all reduced to $100 bill thrown on the floor like alms for an animal. He bent down slowly, each movement a physical and emotional agony. His back protested, not because of the disguise, but because of the weight of disappointment he carried. He picked up the bill with hands that now trembled for real, not from the characterization, but from the pain of a destroyed husband. When he stood up, he looked directly into Isabella's eyes. For a second, just a second, he had the crazy hope that she would recognize him, that something familiar would echo in her memory. But all he saw was disgust, contempt, the coldness of someone looking at something they consider subhuman. "Thank you, madam," Eduardo murmured, putting the bill in his pocket. "May God bless you." Even at the height of humiliation, even feeling his heart shatter, he still managed to find strength to wish blessings on the woman who destroyed him. "Now get out!" Isabella yelled, pointing to the door. "And don't come back. Places like this aren't for people like you." Eduardo walked to the exit under the gaze of 60 people. Some whispered among themselves, others filmed discreetly, but all witnessed the most absolute cruelty disguised as social cleansing. At the door, Giuseppe tried to apologize discreetly. "Sir, I'm very sorry. This isn't how we usually treat people in your situation." Eduardo nodded silently and left for the rainy night. Behind him, he heard Fernanda scream, "That's right, Isa. Show these useless old men what their place is in the world." The applause and laughter that followed echoed down the street like a symphony of cruelty. Eduardo walked 3 blocks to where he had parked his Mercedes S-Class. He got in the car, removed the disguise with trembling hands, and put on the expensive suit he had kept in the back seat. In 15 minutes, he transformed back into businessman Eduardo Santana, owner of one of the city's largest fortunes. But inside, he remained the destroyed husband who had just discovered he was married to a monster. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Alberto Mendez, his lawyer for 20 years. "Dr. Mendez, it's Eduardo. I need you to prepare urgent documents." "Eduardo, it's almost 11 p.m. Did something happen? I need to divorce Isabella today, and I want her to lose all rights to my assets." On the other end of the line, the lawyer swallowed hard. He had known Eduardo for 2 decades and had never heard him with that metallic coldness in his voice. "Eduardo, are you sure? We're talking about millions in prenuptial agreements." "I'm absolutely certain." "And Dr. Mendez?" "Yes. Also prepare papers to create a charity foundation. I want to use 10 million to build a shelter for homeless people. People whom society treats like my wife treated me today." "Eduardo, did something happen tonight?" Eduardo looked through the car window, seeing some homeless people looking for shelter from the rain under awnings. "I discovered who I really married, Dr. Mendez, and I discovered what kind of person I want to be for the rest of my life." That night, Isabella came home at 2 a.m., still laughing with friends about the fun they had with the pathetic beggar. She had no idea she had just destroyed her own life. She had no idea that the disgusting beggar she had humiliated was the man who until that moment had supported her in absolute luxury. Starting tomorrow, Isabella would discover what it meant to be on the other side of cruelty. The next morning, Friday, Isabella woke up at 11 a.m. as always. Her routine was invariable: gym with personal trainer at noon, lunch at an expensive restaurant at 2 p.m., photo session for Instagram at 4 p.m., happy hour with friends at 6 p.m. She went down to have breakfast in the gourmet kitchen of the mansion and found Eduardo sitting at the Carrara marble table, reading the newspaper and drinking Italian espresso. "Good morning, love," she said distractedly, more focused on checking likes on photos she had posted the night before. "Wow, the restaurant stories yesterday got almost 100,000 views. That scene with the beggar went viral." Eduardo folded the newspaper slowly and looked at her over his reading glasses. "Isabella, I need to talk to you." "Talk, But quickly, I have a photo session in a while and need to choose the look. Eduardo got up and walked to her, handing her a sealed envelope. What is this? Open and see. Isabella tore the seal and pulled out the documents. When she read the first lines, her face paled as if she had seen a ghost. Divorce petition, she stammered. Eduardo, is this some kind of bad joke? It's not a joke, Isabella. But why? What did I do wrong? I was always a perfect wife. Eduardo laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Perfect wife? Let's talk about that. He walked to the living room, a 1,000-square-foot space decorated with artworks that cost Isabella millions. Followed him, still holding the papers like they were venomous snakes. Sit down, Eduardo said, pointing to the Italian leather sofa that had cost $80,000. Isabella obeyed, but her hands were visibly trembling. Eduardo, if it's because of my work as an influencer, I can reduce travel. I can spend more time at home. It has nothing to do with your work. Then why? She screamed, getting up from the sofa. 3 years of marriage, Eduardo. 3 years being the woman you always dreamed of. Eduardo walked to the wall, where there was a photo of them both in Santorini during their honeymoon. They were perfect smiles, perfect couple, perfect life, all fake. Isabella, do you remember what happened last night at Palazzo d'Oro? I remember. I laughed even more. Why are you asking? How you treated that elderly man who came in asking for water? Isabella frowned, confused by the question. Eduardo, what does this have to do with our marriage? It has everything to do with it. Eduardo turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, a coldness that made her shiver. That disgusting beggar was me. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella went pale as paper, her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the tick-tock of the $50,000 Swiss clock on the wall. You what? She whispered. I disguised myself as a beggar to test your heart, to see if there was a shred of humanity in the woman I married. Isabella fell onto the sofa as if she had been punched in the stomach. Eduardo, you were testing me. You deceived me. I deceived you. Eduardo exploded, his voice echoing through the room. You spent 3 years deceiving me, pretending to be a decent person, but I didn't know it was you. If you had known, Eduardo shouted even louder. That's your defense? That you only treat people well when you know who they are? He began pacing back and forth like a caged lion. And the other elderly people, Isabella, the other needy ones, do they deserve to be humiliated because they're not your billionaire husband? Isabella tried to get up, but her legs were shaky. Eduardo, love, I can explain. Explain what? How you called me a disgusting beggar? How you threw $100 on the floor as if I were an animal? How you said I didn't have the right to breathe the same air as you? Eduardo's words cut through the air like blades. Each sentence was a cut to Isabella's soul, who began to realize the magnitude of what she had done. I was nervous. The girls were there. I didn't want to seem weak. Weak? Eduardo roared. Treating a human being with dignity would make you seem weak. He stopped in front of her, his eyes burning with disappointment and anger. Isabella, for 3 years you lived in my house, used my money, enjoyed my social status, and last night I discovered who you really are, a cruel person without compassion, without soul. She began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic at losing the luxury life she loved so much. Eduardo, please, I learned my lesson. I will never mistreat a needy person again. I promise. Your promises are worth nothing to me. Eduardo headed for the door but stopped before leaving. Oh, and Isabella? The documents you received include all the details of our prenuptial agreement. You're leaving this house with exactly what you brought when you entered. Nothing more. What do you mean, nothing more? Your jewelry, your cars, your designer clothes, everything was bought with my money. You have 24 hours to leave the house. Eduardo, you can't do this to me. I can and will. And Isabella? What? If you try to use the press against me, if you try to invent lies to benefit yourself, I'll publish the restaurant security video. All of Brazil will see how you treat elderly people in need." Isabella felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. The restaurant security video would show everything: her cruelty, her coldness, her total lack of humanity. It would be the end of her career as an influencer, the end of her social reputation. When Eduardo left the room, Isabella was alone with the weight of her new reality. In 12 hours, she had gone from millionaire wife to woman about to be evicted. She picked up her phone with trembling hands and called Fernanda. "Fernanda, I need your help. Eduardo wants to divorce me." "Divorce? Why? It's a long story. Can I stay at your house for a few days?" Silence on the other end of the line. "Isa, honey, you know I adore you, but our friendship was always kind of based on your social status, right? A divorced and broke woman doesn't match our group. Fernanda, you're not serious." "I am, love. Call when you resolve your financial situation." The call was brutally ended. Isabella stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. She called Carla. "Carla, it's Isa. I need help." "Isa, my dear, I heard about your situation. What an annoying thing. Look, I can't help you because it might affect my image. You understand, right?" Another call ended. She called Patricia. "Patricia, Isa, stop calling us. Everyone already knows you're broke. We don't want to be associated with that." In 2 hours, the 3 women she considered intimate friends had completely abandoned her. 3 years of friendship destroyed in 3 phone calls. Isabella looked at herself in the living room mirror. She was still beautiful, still had the sculptural body, still knew how to be charming, but for the first time she realized that all this was empty when there was no character behind it. That same afternoon, Eduardo was in his office when Dr. Mendez arrived with more documents. "Eduardo, I need to show you something," the lawyer said, putting papers on the mahogany desk. "What is it?" "Isabella tried to hire my services today. She wanted me to find a loophole in the prenuptial agreement." Eduardo didn't seem surprised. "And did you find one?" "No. The agreement we made is bulletproof. She has no right to anything." Dr. Mendez sat in the leather armchair. "But there's something you need to know. She offered to sleep with me in exchange for privileged information about your assets." Eduardo felt disgusted. "And what did you respond? That I've been a lawyer for 30 years and have never mixed profession with other things." She left my office furious. Eduardo shook his head. Every hour that passed, he discovered new aspects of Isabella's sick personality. "Dr. Mendez, how are the foundation papers?" "Ready. $10 million destined for the construction of the Dignity Shelter for homeless people." Eduardo smiled for the first time in days. "You know what makes me happiest? That woman who humiliated me yesterday inadvertently gave me the greatest gift of life." "How so?" "She showed me my true purpose. For years I used my wealth only to accumulate more wealth. Now I know that money without compassion is poison. I'm going to use my fortune to heal wounds, not create them." 2 weeks later, Isabella was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, sharing rent with a stranger she found on a classified website. Her designer clothes had been sold to pay for the first weeks of survival. Her luxury cars confiscated. Her jewelry returned. For the first time in her adult life, she needed to look for a job. The reality was brutal. Her resume basically consisted of digital influencer and businessman's wife. She didn't have a complete higher education, didn't have real professional experience, didn't have practical skills. The first interviews were humiliating. Positions for receptionist, salesperson, attendant. Always the same question. "And what was your last professional experience?" "Well, I was married to a businessman and took care of social media." The interviewers could barely disguise their contempt. A 28-year-old woman with no real professional experience was seen as lazy, opportunistic. After being rejected in 20 interviews, Isabella finally got a job as a salesperson in a clothing store at the mall. Minimum wage, 8 hours standing, dealing with difficult customers. On the first day, she discovered firsthand what it was like to be treated as an employee. "Miss," a customer shouted, "does this dress come in blue? I'll check in storage, madam. Quick, I don't have all day." The customer was a wealthy woman, exactly like Isabella used to be. She treated saleswomen like servants, spoke with contempt, had no patience for anything. Isabella returned from storage with information that there was no dress in blue. "How is there none?" The woman exploded. "What kind of store is this that doesn't have variety? Call the manager." The manager came and humiliated herself, apologizing, promising she would order the dress especially for the customer. Isabella watched the whole scene, realizing this was how she used to treat employees. During breaks, she sat in the tiny cafeteria in the mall's basement and saw her former friends posting photos of expensive trips, sophisticated restaurants, exclusive events. The life she had lost was there, being displayed on the screen of the old phone she had bought used. 3 months after starting work, Isabella was returning home on the crowded 6 p.m. bus when she saw a scene that changed something inside her. An elderly woman of about 70 got on the bus carrying several heavy bags. It was evident she had difficulty walking. The bus was full, no one offered a seat. The lady stood swaying with the bus's movement, clearly uncomfortable. Isabella watched for a few seconds and impulsively stood up. "Ma'am, would you like to sit here?" The elderly woman looked at her with surprise and gratitude. "Oh, my dear, thank you so much. My feet are killing me after a whole day working." "You're welcome, ma'am. It's the least I can do." When the elderly woman sat down, she smiled at Isabella. "What a well-mannered girl. Your parents raised you well." The words echoed in Isabella's mind during the entire trip home. It was the first time in months that someone had complimented her, and the compliment wasn't for her beauty or expensive clothes, but for her character. That night, alone in the small apartment, Isabella looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone different. Her hands were rougher from work. Her face no longer had the expensive skin treatment she did monthly. Her clothes were simple, bought on sale, but there was something in her eyes that didn't exist before. A spark of humanity that was beginning to shine. 6 months after being expelled from the mansion, Isabella was taking her lunch break when she decided to walk through the square near the mall. It was a hot day, and she had brought a sandwich from home to save money. She was sitting on a bench, eating quietly, when she saw an elderly man rummaging through trash, clearly looking for food. Her first instinct was the usual one, turn her face and ignore, but something stopped her. She got up and approached the man. "Excuse me, sir." The elderly man turned, startled. He was a man of about 65, with worn but clean clothes, dignified posture despite the situation. "Do you want something, miss? Are you hungry, sir?" He hesitated before answering. "It's been 2 days since I've had anything hot, miss." Isabella looked at her sandwich. It was little, but it was all she had for lunch. "Would you like to share my sandwich with me?" The man's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure, miss? I don't want to take your food, I'm sure. Let's sit there in the shade." They sat on the bench and shared the sandwich in silence. After a few minutes, the man began to talk. "My name is John. I worked 40 years as an accountant. Lost my job in the pandemic, couldn't pay rent, ended up on the street 8 months ago." Isabella felt her heart squeeze. It was a story that could happen to anyone. "My name is Isabella. I work at a store here in the mall. You're very kind, miss. It's been months since anyone talked to me like I was people." His words echoed like a painful echo of her own past cruelty. How many people had she treated as if they weren't people? "Mr. John, do you have somewhere to sleep tonight? I sleep under the overpass nearby. It's not comfortable, but it's safe." Isabella thought for a moment. "Listen, I don't have much money, but I can pay for a night at a cheap boarding house for you. At least tonight you'll sleep in a bed." John began to cry. "Why would you do this for me, miss? You don't even know me. Because someone taught me that when we can help and don't help, we become accomplices to suffering." The words came out before she could think. They were words she had heard Eduardo say years before when he helped needy people. At the time, she thought it was nonsense. Now she understood the deep meaning. Isabella took John to a simple boarding house and paid for a $30 daily rate. It was half of what she earned per day, but she felt good spending money to help someone, not to show off. When she returned to work, the store manager commented, "Isabella, I saw you helping that gentleman in the square. It was very beautiful of you." "Thank you, Mrs. Maria. You know, you've changed a lot since you started working here. At first you seemed kind of lost, but now you have a different glow in your eyes." Isabella smiled. It was true. She was changing inside, discovering a person she didn't know existed. 2 years after the divorce, Eduardo was inaugurating the Dignity Shelter, a $50 million structure that could house 500 homeless people, offering not only shelter and food, but professional courses, psychological support, and social reintegration opportunities. The inauguration ceremony was attended by politicians, businessmen, and journalists. Eduardo gave an emotional speech about the importance of treating all human beings with dignity. Among those present was Dr. Mendez and also Giuseppe, the maitre d' from Palazzo d'Oro, who had become one of the project's biggest collaborators after witnessing the traumatic scene that Thursday night. "Mr. Eduardo," Giuseppe said after the ceremony, "can I confess something?" "Of course, Giuseppe. That night at the restaurant, I knew something was wrong. That disguised gentleman had a posture, a way of speaking that wasn't of a common homeless person. Why didn't you say anything?" Because I'm also guilty. I treated you with contempt, just like your ex-wife. The difference is that she didn't know it was you, but I should have treated you with dignity regardless of who you were." Eduardo put his hand on the Italian's shoulder. "Giuseppe, the important thing is that we learned, and now we're doing something to fix the mistakes. Mr. Eduardo, can I ask something?" "Of course. Do you know what happened to Mrs. Isabella?" Eduardo was silent for a few seconds. "I know she's working at a clothing store. I know she lives alone in a small apartment. And I know that, according to people who know her, she's different. Different how? More human, less superficial. Maybe the experience taught her something too." That same day, Isabella was working at the store when a woman came in looking for a dress for a corporate event. She was elegant, well-dressed, clearly rich. During the conversation, the woman mentioned that she worked for a consulting company that was helping the Dignity Shelter develop social programs. "What an interesting project," Isabella commented. "It must be gratifying to work with that. It really is. The man who created the project is inspiring. Eduardo Santana. Do you know him?" Isabella felt her heart race. "I know him by name. He has an incredible story. He was married to a terrible woman, a superficial influencer. She humiliated him publicly when he disguised himself to test her character. The divorce was a scandal." Isabella pretended professional interest, but each word was a stab. "And what happened to her?" "She disappeared from the social map, lost all her rich friends, had to work to survive. They say she's completely different now, more humble, more human." The customer continued talking, but Isabella could no longer hear properly. Blood was pounding in her ears. When the woman left the store, Isabella asked for early dismissal from the manager and went home early. She spent the entire afternoon thinking about the words she had heard. Eduardo had become a man admired for his generosity. She had become an example of social downfall, but for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel anger or envy. She felt something like pride. Pride because Eduardo had found his true purpose. Pride because she herself had found her humanity. That night, she made a decision that had been maturing for months. She took a sheet of paper and began to write. "Eduardo, I know you have no reason to read this letter, but I need to write it. 2 years have passed since that terrible night at the restaurant. 2 years since I discovered the monster I was. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I'm not writing to try to come back because I know it's impossible. I write to thank you. You gave me the harshest and most necessary lesson of my life. You showed that I was a cruel person, empty, soulless. But by forcing me to live without privileges, you also gave me the chance to discover who I really could be. Today I work in a clothing store. I earn little, live in a small apartment, have no rich friends. But for the first time in my life, I look in the mirror and like the person I help people when I can. I treat employees with respect. I see beauty in simple things I used to despise. You transformed my punishment into redemption. I heard about the dignity shelter. I read about your work with homeless people. This filled me with pride, not as an ex-wife, but as a human being who recognizes greatness in another. You became the man you should always have been, and I became the woman I never knew I could be. Thank you for breaking me to rebuild me. Thank you for teaching me that wealth without character is absolute poverty. I wish all the happiness in the world for you. Isabella. She reread the letter 3 times, cried for several minutes, then put it in an envelope and addressed it to Eduardo's office. A week later, Eduardo was in his office when his secretary announced there was a personal letter for him. When he saw the sender, he hesitated to open it. He read the letter twice, slowly. When he finished, he remained silent for long minutes, looking out the window at the city that stretched below. Dr. Mendez, who had arrived for a meeting, noticed the thoughtful expression on his friend's face. "Did something happen, Eduardo?" Eduardo showed him the letter. "Isabella wrote to me," the lawyer read quickly. "What do you think?" "I think people really can change, when they're broken the right way. Will you respond?" Eduardo thought for a few seconds. "I will, but not as an ex-husband. As a human being recognizing another human being's evolution." He wrote a short response. "Isabella, your letter touched me deeply. I'm happy to know you found your humanity, that you found peace. That was all I hoped for when I started that test. Not to destroy you, but to rebuild you. Keep being that better person you discovered yourself to be. The world needs her. Eduardo." When Isabella received the response, she cried for an hour, not from sadness, but from relief. The cycle had closed. Forgiveness had been granted. Redemption was complete. 5 years after the divorce, Isabella opened her own clothing store in the neighborhood where she lived. It was small, simple, but prosperous. She had learned to manage money, treat employees with respect, build genuine relationships with customers. Her clientele was mainly working women like her, housewives, employees, students, real people with real lives, real problems. She had become known in the community for her kindness and the fair prices she practiced. Once a month, she donated clothes to a local women's shelter. Eduardo, meanwhile, had expanded his social project. The Dignity Shelter had become a network of 5 units, serving more than 2,000 homeless people. He had become a national reference in social policies. They never remarried. Eduardo dated a few times, but no relationship prospered. His energy was channeled into social work. Isabella also remained single. There were some suitors, good men, who knew her in her current life, but she felt she was still learning to be a better person. On a Saturday in June, 7 years after the fateful night at the restaurant, destiny made them meet in an unexpected situation. Eduardo was visiting one of the shelters when he saw a woman distributing clothes to the residents. From behind, she seemed familiar, but he couldn't immediately identify her. When she turned around, their eyes met. It was Isabella, but a completely transformed Isabella. Her hair was shorter, without dye. She wore simple clothes, without brand names. Her hands were without the perfect nails from before. But there was something in her face that made her more beautiful than ever. Inner peace. "Eduardo," she said simply. "Isabella." They looked at each other for a few seconds in silence. There was no anger, no resentment. Just the mutual recognition of 2 people who had traveled difficult journeys and come out better on the other side. "Do you work here?" Eduardo asked. "I'm a volunteer on Saturdays. I help with clothing donations and talk with the women. Many went through situations similar to mine." Similar situations. They lost everything because of bad choices. They're trying to rebuild their lives. Eduardo nodded. "And you? How are you?" "Well, I have a small store in the neighborhood. It's not luxurious, but it's mine. I built it with my own work." Isabella paused. "And I'm happy, really happy. Maybe for the first time in my life." Eduardo smiled. "I'm happy for you." They talked for a few more minutes about trivial things. When they said goodbye, it was with a respectful handshake. "Thank you, Eduardo," Isabella said before leaving. "For what?" "For teaching me the difference between having value and being valuable." That night, 7 years before, reflected on he had tested a woman's heart and discovered she didn't have one. Today, he had found a completely different woman, with a heart that pulsed with true compassion. The cruelest test of his life had produced 2 winners. He had discovered his purpose. She had discovered her soul. And perhaps that had been the most perfect possible result. A few months after this encounter, Eduardo received an unexpected invitation. Isabella was organizing a charity event to raise winter clothes for homeless people. She wanted to know if he would like to participate. Eduardo accepted immediately. The event took place on a Saturday afternoon in the community hall of the neighborhood where Isabella lived. It was simple but well organized. There were about 100 people present, most from the community itself. Isabella gave a moving speech about the importance of helping those most in need. She spoke about her own transformation, without naming names or personal details, but making it clear she had learned through pain the value of compassion. Eduardo watched admiringly. The woman on stage was completely different from the superficial influencer he had known 8 years before. There was substance in her words, authenticity in her gestures. After the event, while they helped organize the donations, Eduardo commented, "You speak very well in public. I learned by necessity. When you don't have money to hire other people, you need to do everything yourself. And don't you miss it? The previous life." Isabella stopped folding clothes and looked at him with sincerity. "Eduardo, I'll confess something to you. Sometimes I miss the financial comfort. It would be a lie to say I don't, but I would never miss the person I was." She continued, "At that time, I woke up every day empty inside. I had everything any woman could want, but I had no peace. Now I wake up knowing my life has purpose. It's a feeling no money can buy." Eduardo nodded. "I understand perfectly. I spent 50 years accumulating wealth, but only felt really rich when I started distributing it." They continued working in comfortable silence. There was a harmony between them that had never existed when they were married. When they finished, Eduardo offered to take her home. During the trip, they talked about each other's social projects. "You know, Isabella, I have a proposal for you." "What kind of proposal?" "I'm expanding the shelter's social reintegration program. I need someone who understands the reality of women in vulnerable situations, someone who went through real personal transformation." Isabella looked at him surprised. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering an opportunity to amplify your social impact. The salary would be 3 times what you earn at the store." She was silent for a few seconds. "Eduardo, this isn't an attempt to get back together." "No, Isabella. This is recognition that you became exactly the kind of person our projects need. Can I think about it?" "Of course." A week later, Isabella called, accepting the proposal. Her first week in the new job was revealing. Eduardo had created a healthy professional environment based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The team was formed by people who genuinely cared about social causes. Isabella adapted quickly. Her personal experience with social downfall made her especially effective at dealing with women who had lost everything. She developed workshops on rebuilding self-esteem, basic financial planning, job searching. But what most touched the assisted women were her personal accounts of transformation. "When you lose everything you think is important," she would say in the workshops, "you discover that the really important things were never at risk. Dignity, character, the ability to love and be loved. No one can take that from you." Eduardo observed her work with growing admiration. Isabella had become a natural leader, inspiring other women through her example of overcoming. 6 months after she started working on the project, they were reviewing reports on a Friday afternoon when Isabella asked a question that surprised him. "Eduardo, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you really forgive me?" "Completely." Eduardo put down the papers and looked at her directly. "Isabella, forgiveness presupposes there was an offense. I no longer see that night as an offense." "What do you mean?" I see it as the moment I discovered my true vocation, as the moment you discovered who you really could be. It was painful, but it was necessary." He paused. "Besides, the woman who offended me that night no longer exists. The person here in front of me is someone completely different." Isabella felt her eyes fill with tears. "Thank you for saying that. It's the truth." They returned to work, but something had changed in the air between them. A deeper complicity, based on mutual respect and shared purpose. 2 years later, Eduardo and Isabella had become an efficient duo in coordinating social projects. He took care of the financial and strategic part, she of the operational and human part. The program had grown exponentially. Now it served more than 5,000 people in vulnerable situations in 10 different cities. Isabella had become a nationally recognized speaker, telling her transformation story to inspire other people. At one of these events in Brasilia, she was speaking to an audience of 500 business people about social responsibility when someone from the audience asked a provocative question. "Ms. Isabella, how do we know your transformation is genuine and not just a strategy to win back your billionaire ex-husband?" The silence in the auditorium was total. All faces turned to her, curious to see how she would respond. Isabella smiled calmly. "It's a fair question, and I'll answer with total honesty. First, my ex-husband and I have a strictly professional relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Second, if my motivation were to win him back, I would have chosen a much easier path than working 12 hours a day with homeless people." She made a dramatic pause. "But the main reason I know my transformation is genuine is very simple. I wake up every day at peace with myself. When I was rich and superficial, I had everything money could buy, but couldn't sleep at night because deep down, I knew I was an empty person." The audience was completely silent, absorbed in her words. "Today I sleep like a baby, even living in a simple apartment, and earning a fraction of what I used to spend monthly on because shoes. I know I'm using my life for something greater than my own pleasure." The applause was deafening. After the event, Eduardo, who had watched from the audience, approached her. "Perfect answer. It was sincere. I know. That's why it was perfect." They walked together to the hotel where they were staying. "Isabella, can I ask you a question now?" "Of course. Are you happy?" She stopped walking and thought for a few seconds. "Eduardo, I'll give you the most honest answer I can. I'm happy in a way I didn't even know existed. It's a happiness that doesn't depend on external circumstances. It comes from within." She continued, "When I was your wife, my happiness depended on Instagram likes, expensive clothes, others' envy. It was fragile happiness that could be destroyed by anything. Now my happiness comes from knowing I'm living according to my real values." Eduardo nodded. "I understand. It's the difference between pleasure and genuine happiness." They reached the hotel entrance. "Eduardo, exactly. Yes? Thank you. For what this time? For giving me a second chance. Professionally, I mean. Isabella, you earned that chance. I just recognized what was obvious. Good night, Eduardo." "Good night, Isabella." 10 years had passed since the fateful night at Palazzo d'Oro. Eduardo, now 65, had become an international reference in strategic philanthropy. His social projects benefited more than 50,000 people in 20 countries. Isabella, at 38, had become executive director of the Dignity Foundation, the organization that coordinated all of Eduardo's social projects. She was respected as one of the country's leading experts in female social reintegration. They continued working together harmoniously, but their personal lives had taken different paths. Eduardo had been dating for 2 years a 45-year-old volunteer doctor he met at one of the shelters. It was a mature relationship based on shared values. Isabella remained single by choice. There were some suitors, but she felt she was still discovering who she really was and preferred to focus on her personal growth. On a December morning, exactly 10 years after the test at the restaurant, they were in a strategic planning meeting when Eduardo made an announcement that surprised the entire team. "Everyone, I have important news. I've decided to retire from active project management." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. "Don't worry," he continued. "I won't abandon the cause, but it's time to pass the baton to a new generation." "And who will take over?" someone asked. Eduardo looked directly at Isabella. "I want to propose that Isabella assume as president of the foundation." All eyes turned to her. Isabella was clearly shocked. "Eduardo, I don't know if I'm prepared." "You're more prepared than anyone I know. You have operational experience, know our beneficiaries deeply, have credibility with the team, and, mainly, have the passion necessary to take the projects forward." The vote was unanimous. Isabella was elected by acclamation. After the meeting, they were alone in the conference room. "Eduardo, thank you for the trust, but why now?" "Because it's time, and because there's no one better to continue this work." He got up and walked to the window. "Isabella, 10 years ago I did a test to discover your character. Today I can say the test continues, and you pass with distinction every day." She felt a lump in her throat. "Eduardo, I'll never be able to completely erase that night. You shouldn't try. That night is part of your story. It's what makes your transformation even more powerful. When you speak to other people about change, they know you really understand what you're talking about." They remained silent for a few moments, watching the city's movement below. "You know what impresses me most about you?" Eduardo said finally. "What? You could have used your story to victimize yourself. You could have blamed society, money, anything. But you chose to take total responsibility and transform yourself. That's rare." Isabella smiled sadly. "I had no choice. Either I changed or I sank completely. You chose the hardest path, but the only one that led to real redemption." 2 months after the power transition, Isabella was on her first official day as president of the Dignity Foundation. She arrived early at the office at 7 a.m. and found a handwritten letter on her desk. She immediately recognized Eduardo's elegant handwriting. "Isabella, today you officially assume leadership of a dream we built together. But I want you to know this isn't the end of our partnership. It's just a new phase. I'll always be available as advisor, friend, and, mainly, as someone who has profound admiration for the extraordinary woman you became. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined writing these words to you. Today, I can't imagine this project in anyone else's hands. May God bless your leadership, and may our mission continue saving lives and transforming hearts. With affection and respect, Eduardo." Isabella carefully folded the letter and kept it in the first drawer of the desk. It would be a daily reminder of how far she had come. Her first act as president was to call a meeting with the entire team. "I want you to know that, although I'm formally assuming the presidency, nothing will change in our essence. We'll continue treating each person we help as if they were our own family. We'll continue believing that every life has value. We'll continue proving that human transformation is possible." She paused and looked at each face in the room. "I am living proof that people can change. Each of you also carries a transformation story. Together, we'll continue being instruments of hope for those who lost everything." The applause was warm and genuine. In the first 6 months of her management, Isabella implemented innovations that impressed even Eduardo. She created a mentorship program where former beneficiaries helped newcomers. She established partnerships with companies to guarantee real professional insertion. She developed a follow-up system that drastically reduced recidivism. The results were extraordinary. The social reintegration rate rose from 60% to 85%. The program became an international model, being studied by organizations in 15 countries. On a July afternoon, Isabella was working late when she received an unexpected visit. It was Mrs. Maria, the manager of the store where she had worked years ago. "Isabella! Wow, what a difference! You look radiant. Mrs. Maria, what a wonderful surprise. I saw a report about you on television. I couldn't believe it was the same girl who worked at my store. They sat in the office reception area. Tell me, Mrs. Maria, how are things at the store?" "Well, thank God. But you know what makes me happiest?" "What?" I remember how you changed during the time you worked with me. You arrived kind of lost, seemed like you were pretending to be someone else. But gradually you became more true, more human. Maria continued, I always told my husband, that girl has something special. She just needed to discover what it was. And look where you got. You were very important in my transformation. You treated me with dignity when I most needed it. Nonsense. I just treated you like any human being deserves to be treated. Exactly. And at the time, that was revolutionary for me. They talked for another hour, remembering the difficult but transformative days at the store. When Mrs. Maria left, Isabella was thinking about how certain people appear in our lives exactly at the right moment. Mrs. Maria had been an anchor of humanity during her most vulnerable phase. That night, at home, Isabella looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and did her daily balance, a habit she had developed in recent years. She saw a 38-year-old woman with some expression lines that didn't exist before, hands that told stories of real work, eyes that reflected inner peace conquered with much effort. Thank you, she said to the mirror, as she always did. Thank you for breaking me to rebuild me better. It was her daily prayer of gratitude for the journey that brought her there. 15 years after the night at Palazzo d'Oro, Eduardo organized a special event to celebrate the extraordinary results of the Dignity Foundation. It was an elegant ceremony, but with purpose, to publicly recognize Isabella's work and raise funds to expand the projects. The hall was packed with 500 guests, business people, politicians, journalists, but mainly former program beneficiaries who had rebuilt their lives. Eduardo was the first to speak. 15 years ago, a painful experience taught me that wealth without purpose is absolute poverty. Today we celebrate not just impressive numbers, but transformed lives. And the person who best represents this transformation is our president, Isabella Santana. The applause was long and warm. When Isabella took the stage, the silence was respectful. Everyone knew her story. Everyone knew where she had come from to get there. Friends, she began, her voice firm and clear. 15 years ago, I was a terrible person, rich in money, poor in character, cruel by choice, superficial by convenience. She made a dramatic pause. One night, I treated an elderly person in need with the most absolute cruelty. I humiliated a human being for pure pleasure. I didn't know that elderly person was my own husband in disguise, testing my heart. Some murmurs ran through the hall. Even knowing the story, people were still impressed by her courage to expose her own shame. When I discovered the truth, my first instinct was anger. How dare he test me? How dare he deceive me? But gradually I understood that the only deceived one there was myself. I had deceived myself thinking I was a decent person. Isabella looked directly at Eduardo, who was in the front row. That test gave me the greatest gift of my life, the opportunity to become who I really should be. The applause started spontaneously, but she gestured for silence. Today, 15 years later, I can say I'm genuinely happy. I don't have the material wealth I had before, but I have something much more valuable, peace of conscience. I wake up every day knowing my life has purpose. She walked across the stage, establishing eye contact with different parts of the audience. For those here today representing companies and can help financially fund our projects, my request is simple: invest in human transformation. Every dollar applied to our programs saves lives and rebuilds hopes. For those here as former beneficiaries of our programs, my message is you are living proof that it doesn't matter how deep you fell, it's always possible to get up stronger. The audience was completely hypnotized by her words. And for those going through your own dark night of the soul, I want to say, accept the breaking. It hurts, but it's the only path to true reconstruction. Isabella returned to the center of the stage for her final sentence. I end with a reflection that guides my life. We are not defined by our worst moments, but by the courage we have to transform ourselves after them. The hall exploded in applause that lasted 5 minutes. People crying, embracing, celebrating not just the foundation's numbers, but the power of human redemption. When Isabella came down from the stage, Eduardo was waiting for her with a respectful embrace. "Perfect speech," he said. "It was from the heart. I know. That's why it was perfect." That night, after the event, they walked together to the parking lot. It was a clear night, with stars visible even in Sao Paulo's urban sky. "Eduardo, can I make a confession?" "Of course. Sometimes I still dream about that night at the restaurant." "Nightmares?" "No. Dreams of gratitude. I dream about that moment and wake up grateful it happened." Eduardo stopped walking and looked at her with admiration. "Isabella, you transformed your greatest trauma into your greatest strength. That's rare. I learned that we can't choose what happens to us, but we can choose what we do with what happens to us." They reached the cars. Eduardo drove a simple sedan without ostentation. Isabella had a popular car, efficient and economical. "Good night, Isabella. Good night, Eduardo, and thank you." "For what?" "For giving me the honor of witnessing your transformation, for teaching me that even the most wounded hearts can be healed." Isabella smiled with that serene smile she had learned to cultivate in recent years. "The honor was mine, Eduardo, for finding someone who believed in my capacity to change when I didn't even believe in myself." They said goodbye with a respectful handshake, each going their way in the starry night. 20 years had passed since that fateful Thursday at Palazzo d'Oro. 2 decades of transformation, growth, redemption. Eduardo, at 75, continued as advisor to the Dignity Foundation, but dedicated most of his time to writing books about strategic philanthropy. He married the volunteer doctor and lived in a simple house, surrounded by books and memories of a well-lived life. Isabella, at 48, had become an international personality. Her books on personal transformation were bestsellers in 12 countries. She lectured at universities worldwide. The Dignity Foundation, under her leadership, benefited more than 100,000 people annually. But what made her proudest weren't the numbers or recognitions. It was the letters she received every week from people who had changed their lives after hearing her story. In one of these letters, a 25-year-old young woman wrote, "Mrs. Isabella, I was exactly like you were before, rich, cruel, without compassion. I heard your lecture at the university and cried for 3 straight days, recognizing in your words the terrible person I had become. I decided to change. I started doing volunteer work at a nursing home. Today, 2 years later, I left my job at an investment bank and work at an NGO that helps abandoned elderly people. I've never been so happy. Thank you for showing me that transformation is possible." Isabella kept these letters in a special box. They were her real measure of success. On a December morning, exactly 20 years after the test at the restaurant, Isabella was in her office when she received an unexpected call. It was Giuseppe, the former maitre d' of Palazzo d'Oro. "Mrs. Isabella, I hope you remember me." "Giuseppe, of course I remember. How are you?" "Well, thank God. Mrs. Isabella, I'm calling because I want to make a special invitation." "What kind of invitation?" "The palazzo will close permanently at the end of the month. After 40 years, the owner decided to retire. We're organizing one last farewell party, and I would very much like you and Mr. Eduardo to be present." Isabella felt her heart race, returned to the place where it all began. "Giuseppe, I don't know if it's a good idea. Mrs. Isabella, with all respect, I think it would be a beautiful way to close a cycle. You and Mr. Eduardo transformed that terrible night into something beautiful. It would be fair for you to be at the farewell of the place that changed your lives." Isabella thought for a few seconds. "Let me talk to Eduardo, and I'll give you an answer." "Thank you, Mrs. Isabella. I hope to see you there." When she hung up, Isabella stared out the window for long minutes. Returning to Palazzo d'Oro would be like returning to the scene of the crime. But maybe Giuseppe was right. Maybe it was time to completely close the cycle. She called Eduardo. "Did you get a call from Giuseppe?" "I did. What a coincidence, right? Just as 20 years are completed. What do you think?" "I think we should go, not to relive the past, but to celebrate the present." "Are you sure?" "I am." Isabella, that place gave us a gift. It would be ungrateful not to say goodbye to it properly. On the night of Palazzo d'Oro's farewell party, Eduardo and Isabella arrived together. The restaurant was packed, with all the famous patrons of the last decades. When they entered, there was a momentary silence. Everyone there knew the story. Everyone knew what had happened in that place 20 years before. Giuseppe approached with tears in his eyes. "Thank you for coming. You can't imagine what it means to me to have you here." He led them to a special table in the center of the hall. It was exactly where Isabella had been sitting that fateful night. During dinner, several people approached to greet them. Business people who collaborated with the foundation, journalists who had covered their story, former restaurant employees. But the most emotional moment was when a man of about 40 approached the table. "Mrs. Isabella, excuse the interruption. My name is Robert. I was a waiter here 20 years ago." Isabella looked at him attentively. "I remember you, sir." "Mrs. Isabella, I was working that night. I saw everything. And I must confess that at the time I didn't understand the gravity of what I was witnessing." Robert paused, visibly moved. "Years later, when I learned the complete story, when I saw your transformation, when I understood what had really happened, that changed my life too." "How so?" Eduardo asked. "I started treating all people with more respect, regardless of appearance or social situation. I taught this to my children. And today, I own a small chain of restaurants where rule number 1 is, every customer is treated with dignity, no matter who they are." Isabella felt her eyes fill with tears. "Robert, thank you for telling me this. It's a gift to know our story inspired changes in other people. You gave me the most important lesson of my professional life. Thank you." When Robert walked away, Eduardo and Isabella remained silent for a few minutes. 20 years, Eduardo murmured. "Who would have thought that terrible night would generate so much good? It's as if everything had a greater purpose we couldn't see at the time." Near the end of the night, Giuseppe went up on a small stage and gave a farewell speech. "Friends, after 40 years serving you, it's time to close the doors of Palazzo d'Oro. But before that, I want to tell a story that few here know completely." He looked directly at Eduardo and Isabella. "Exactly 20 years ago, in this hall, a scene happened that changed not only 2 people's lives, but inspired one of the greatest social transformations I've ever witnessed. The silence in the hall was total. A man tested his wife's heart and discovered she didn't have one. A woman discovered she had become a monster and decided to transform into an angel. And all of us who witnessed that scene learned lessons about humanity, compassion, and redemption." Giuseppe paused, his eyes shining with emotion. "Eduardo and Isabella, you transformed the cruelest night in this restaurant's history into the most beautiful story of human transformation I know. Thank you for teaching us that it's never too late to change. Never too late to become a better person." The applause was deafening. People crying, embracing, celebrating not just the closing of a restaurant, but the power of human redemption. When they left Palazzo d'Oro for the last time, Eduardo and Isabella walked slowly to the parking lot. "How do you feel?" Eduardo asked. "At peace. Completely and definitively at peace." They stopped next to the cars. "Eduardo, thank you. For what this time? For believing I could change when I didn't even believe it myself, for giving me the second chance I didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Isabella, you earned every opportunity you received. I just recognized what was happening. Still, thank you." They hugged, a hug of deep friendship, mutual respect, and shared gratitude. When they separated, Isabella had tears in her eyes. "You know what makes me happiest about all this?" "What?" "We're no longer the people we were that night. You're no longer the man who needed to test his wife's character. I'm no longer the cruel woman who humiliated elderly people. We're completely new people." Eduardo smiled. "And better people. Much better." They said goodbye once more, each going their way in the night. But this time there was no weight in the air. There was no resentment, no regret, only gratitude for the path traveled and hope for the future. And as she drove home that historic night, Isabella looked in the rearview mirror and saw Palazzo d'Oro disappearing in the distance. Along with it, the cruel and superficial version of herself disappeared forever. What remained was a transformed woman, a life with purpose, a heart that learned to truly love. And thus ends the most unlikely redemption story these golden walls ever witnessed. A billionaire who disguised himself as a beggar to test his wife and discovered he had married a monster. A woman who humiliated her own husband and ended up discovering her own humanity. Two broken human beings who allowed themselves to be rebuilt. Two wounded souls who found healing in compassion. Two lives that proved that no matter how deep you fall, it's always possible to rise stronger. True wealth, they discovered, isn't in what we accumulate for ourselves, but in what we build for others. Genuine happiness doesn't come from what we possess, but from what we become. And the purest love isn't the one that accepts us as we are, but the one that challenges us to become who we can be. 25 years later, when Isabella turned 53, she was lecturing at a university when a young student asked a question that surprised her. "Professor Isabella, if you could go back in time, would you change anything about that night at the restaurant?" Isabella thought for long seconds before answering. "My first reaction would be to say yes, that I would change everything. That I would treat that elderly man with affection, that I would discover he was my husband, that I would avoid all the pain we caused each other." She made a dramatic pause. "But if I did that, I would never have discovered the monster I was. I would never have been forced to change. I would never have found my true purpose. The 100,000 people our foundation helped would remain helpless. The audience was hypnotized, so no, I wouldn't change anything. Because sometimes we need to hit bottom to discover our strength to climb up. Sometimes we need to be broken to be rebuilt the right way." Isabella looked directly at the young woman who had asked the question. The pain was terrible, but it was temporary. The transformation was difficult, but it was permanent, and the impact was greater than I ever dreamed possible. After the lecture, Isabella returned home and found a surprise in the mailbox. It was a letter from Eduardo, who now at 80 was living in a retirement home voluntarily, helping other elderly people. "My dear friend Isabella, today marks 25 years since the night that changed our lives. I want you to know that not a day goes by without me being grateful that test happened, not just because I discovered who you really were, but because I discovered who I really could be. You transformed my bitterest disappointment into my sweetest joy. You transformed my cruelest test into the most generous gift. Today, at 80, I can say with absolute certainty, it was worth every tear, every moment of pain, every second of uncertainty, because it brought us here, to this place of peace, purpose, and fulfillment. Thank you for being brave enough to change. Thank you for teaching me that miracles happen every day in the form of people who decide to become better. With love and eternal admiration, Eduardo." Isabella carefully folded the letter and placed it with all the others they had exchanged over the years. That night, as she had done every night for 25 years, she looked at herself in the mirror and said her prayer of gratitude. "Thank you for breaking me to rebuild me better. Thank you for showing me that true love sometimes looks like cruelty. Thank you for proving it's never too late for a second chance." And as she prepared for sleep, Isabella smiled, thinking about the perfect irony of her story. She had started as a woman who humiliated beggars. She ended as a woman who dedicated her life to giving dignity to the needy. She had started married to a billionaire for interest. She ended being friends with a man out of mutual respect and genuine love. She had started rich in money and poor in character. She ended poor in material goods and rich in purpose. The most unlikely transformation had become the most complete redemption. And so, in these final words, I, the butler billionaire, close this story that proves a fundamental truth. We are not prisoners of our worst moments. We are architects of our best futures. True wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we give, Genuine happiness doesn't come from what we possess, but from what we become. And the purest love isn't the one that accepts us as we are, but the one that inspires us to be who we can be. Remember, when life tests you, when you're forced to look in the mirror of truth, when you discover you might not be who you thought you were, accept the breaking. It's painful, but it's the only path to true reconstruction. Because in the end, we won't be judged by the height of our pedestal, but by the depth of our compassion. Not by the greatness of our possessions, but by the generosity of our heart. And always remember, even the most wounded heart can be healed. Even the most lost soul can find its way back home. Even the cruelest person can learn to love. This is the most valuable lesson the golden halls of wealth can teach. This is the truth every billionaire should know. This is the wisdom each of us needs to embrace. Life's hardest test is always the most precious gift in disguise. And when you understand this, my dear friends, you will have discovered the secret that makes anyone truly rich. Until the next story, may it find you wiser, more compassionate, and more human than when we began this journey. I am the Butler Billionaire, and these were the words you needed to hear.